Hi, and welcome to the Days Gone podcast. I'm Claire Weaver, a screenwriter, author, and Days Gone fan, and this podcast is a place to discuss the game in all its glory, share my opinions, both popular and unpopular, and listen to me fangirl over one of the best games ever made. There will be spoilers ahead, so continue at your own risk. Welcome to the Freak Show. Before we get started, I want to let you know you can get your Days Gone inspired merchandise at the new URL of beartraptavern.threadless.com. There's tees, tanks, sweaters, pins, stickers, notebooks, phone cases, art prints, and more, and it all ships internationally so you can rep your love of the game all around the world. Today, I am very excited to welcome to the show an incredible guest who I've wanted to talk to since my very first playthrough of the game. He is none other than the writer and creative director of Days Gone, Mr. John Garvin. Hi, John. How are you doing today?
Hey, Claire. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I have a lot of questions for you about Days Gone, so I say we just get right into it. Starting at the beginning, what was your original vision for the game, and how did it change through the development process?
That's an awesome question. Before we jump into that, I just want to say, dude, this is an awesome podcast. I remember you sending me a link to it back when you had Jason Spisak on, and I just forgot about it, and I just never had time because I was super busy. And then I saw on Sam Whitworth's feed that he came on recently. So I'm like, oh, shoot, that's right. There's this podcast that's about the game. And so I listened to quite a few episodes, and I got to say, you know the game as well as I do.
Oh, well, thank you for saying so. This podcast has come out of my passion for the game, my love of the game. I don't know what else to say. I know I've learned a lot through doing the podcast as I've gone, talking to a lot of people from Bend, a lot of the creators behind it. And it's a real honor to get to talk to you today.
Yeah, so the original vision for the game is the mechanic of the Horde. That's really where we started, because I think World War Z had just come out, Brad Pitt's movie, and they had done some amazing visual effects with zombies in that game. And yes, I do call them zombies now, even though they are freakers. We're all clear about that. But that's where it started. It started like, okay, for game development, you always want to find a new idea and a new gameplay idea. And this is kind of one I worked with Jeff Ross on, and it was just very early on. It was going to be we had a demo working on the Vita using our engine from Uncharted Golden Abyss. And, we had an engineer who was kind of a prodigy genius who was able to get, hundreds of freakers running around chasing the player. And, and that sort of started the idea of like, hey, this is going to be a game where you're going to face insurmountable odds, and all you can do is run and set up traps and upgrade to better weapons and so on. And then for me, it started as an idea of like, what is number one, what is a game I want to play? And number two, what haven't I seen before? So, bikers and biker culture, they've been done, right? There's been like an expansion pack on Grand Theft Auto and a couple of others. A couple of really fun games from the 90s, actually. But I had never seen it done kind of seriously. And so I was a huge fan of Sons of Anarchy at the time. And, because what people don't realize if they haven't seen Sons is that, yes, it's got all your typical biker tropes. It's got obviously the bikes and, violence and fist fights and shootouts and, gang warfare. All that stuff is there, but there's also an intense, mother-son story and an intense love story. And, it's about family and it's about friendship and it's heartbreaking. So that's kind of what I wanted. I wanted to say, hey, what if we had a game where you expect it to be over the top? You expect it to be, really, really broad. And, and to be honest, for a while, early development, it kind of was. I think Sam mentioned this when he was on. We had done a few versions of early scenes where it felt more, more sort of tongue in cheek. And it was like a Tango and Cash kind of vibe between Deacon and Boozer as they're, busting each other's balls and stuff. But, I moved pretty quickly away from that. So the further we got into development, it sort of solidified into what it is now, which is like, I really wanted to have. I was super inspired by Red Dead Redemption, the first one,
Oh
and
yeah.
loved that scene where you're crossing the Rio, and then that Far Away song kicks in, and I was like, man, to me that is the most amazing moment I've ever had in a video game, and I kind of wanted to recreate that in Days Gone, so I kind of put 3 of them in.
I
So
mean,
yeah, that's kind of where it started. It started as a horde game and became kind of a heartfelt adventure game as you're following this poor dude's life. And not just trying to survive, but trying to find a meaning to live. I think was a catchphrase I came up with pretty early.
yeah, I mean, I've said before that the emotional resonance of the story is incredible. You can tell that you put a lot of thought into that, and there's a strong emotional core to the story that takes it beyond just a biker fighting zombies kind of game.
Yes, I steered away from biker tropes pretty early as well, because you notice that the interface, for example, we had an early version that was all about the bikers, and it had tattoos and all that stuff, and then we hired this guy who brought a really clean aesthetic to it, Shay, and he did what I think is a very non-biker look and feel, which was perfect for me, because I wanted to avoid the things you would expect to find in a game about bikers surviving in a freaker apocalypse. And so everything about that part of Deacon's life, I didn't get rid of it, but I definitely toned it down. I mean, I kept it for one of the storylines, certainly with Carlos and Jesse,
Mm-hmm.
and you get a little more information. And there was a lot of material that ended up getting cut just for scope. So, for example, the character Jack, who was Deacon's mentor and brought him into the club, he was actually part of the game for a while, and then it just got to be too much backstory and not enough happening in the Oregon apocalypse.
Interesting. I was going to ask if there was anything that got cut along the way. Wasn't it originally planned as a trilogy?
Yeah, so I haven't spent a lot of time talking about that. So yeah, so since we're talking about big ideas, it's like I never really pitched this to anyone because I didn't want them to think I was crazy, because we were having a hard enough time making one game. So, but I always envisioned the game from the beginning to be a trilogy, because I've always worked, if you know anything about my gaming history, I've always worked with sequels. I've always, like, Siphon Filter had 6 sequels or something by the time we were done, and then when we did Resistance Retribution, that was kind of a sequel to the first Resistance game. I really like that kind of continuity between characters and story. And so in my head, and this is just purely me now, right? So I don't work for Sony or anything, but in my head, I was thinking, this is the first part of a trilogy. What I really wanted to do was something that I haven't seen done in games before. And that's that you're not only evolving the characters and story over the course of the 3 games, you're evolving the core mechanic. And so for Days Gone, it was going to be, my analogy was The Walking Dead. It's just pure mindless zombies. And they're running around like crazy. They're killing everything in sight. They've destroyed the world. And, you've got to learn how to fight them and take them out. But then what would happen in the sequel if the zombies got smarter, right? Because I hinted this all throughout Days Gone. They're evolving. They're evolving quickly. And, if you follow the Nero missions, where you have the different neuroscientists, sort of verbalizing out loud, some of them are actually smarter now, right? Some of them still wear their jewelry, and some of them are, hanging out where they used to live and that kind of thing. So, they sort of theorizing about vestigial memory and intelligence. Well, what would happen if they, I had a scene in mind for the sequel where Deacon's out on a mission. And yes, the sequel would be 100% about Deacon and Sarah again. I know you guys have speculated a lot that you want it to be about Lisa, but no. Lisa's a great character, but she's not the core of the story. The core of the story is Deacon and Sarah.
Okay.
And so he's out on a mission, and then suddenly the freakers are armed. They have weapons. They have clubs and spears, and they have makeshift armor and shields on. So the second game, the first game is The Walking Dead. The second game is Planet of the Apes, because you're dealing with a lot of suddenly very smart enemies, and they still want to kill you. But you've got to deal with the fact that, they're having kids, and they have small villages of their own, and they're just mortal enemies of human beings.
Interesting.
yeah, and in this at the same time, you're dealing with obviously you're going to be dealing with O'Brien, right? Because
Hmm.
he's an evolved freaker as well. So, I won't go into too many my ideas for like how that would have all turned out. But bottom line is, you're still fighting freakers, and you're still fighting. Only this time it's gloves off. You can fight Nero because you have to. So Nero becomes kind of a high tech enemy versus the low tech freakers that you're fighting in the sequel. And then the third game would have been full on evolution blown up. So you've got mostly it's dealing with Nero because now Nero is kind of like they are in fact for all intents and purposes they're aliens, right? So the game becomes more like something like War of the Worlds or Falling Skies because
Hmm.
you're evolving the mechanic of the game in interesting ways while trying to keep the aesthetic that was established in the first game. That would have been my goal, is to try to like build it and expand it in really interesting ways.
That would have been so fucking cool.
I know, right? Well, I'll give you a couple of other tidbits. One is Sarah's pregnant, and so that ups the stakes for Deacon, and it's worse than you think because it's not only how do you survive in it with a pregnancy in a world like this, but also don't forget she's been doing this research. Is it possible the baby's infected? And what does that mean?
Oh my God. That would,
Yeah. And then I had one more scene I'll tell you about because after I left Sony, I had a few weeks, where I was basically sort of shell shocked, to be honest, because
yeah.
I'd been at Sony for 20 years. And, I'm a workaholic, so I work all the time. And suddenly I had nothing to work on except, I ended up publishing a book and doing some other things. And this is before I started working on Asphalt. But for a few weeks there, all I could do was just write down my ideas for what I would have done with the sequel because I just had them in my head. I just wanted them down so that, for my own pleasure, I would know where the story was going to go. And so I always like to have these little callbacks. Like Lisa would have been an important part of the second story. Ricky and Addie being together, that would have become a thing. Deacon would have moved and Boozer would have moved the entire Lost Lake camp to Iron Butte because it's just the facility there. It has food. It's got electricity. It's much safer. It's got an electric fence around it. So they basically just moved the whole Lost Lake camp there. That's when things go bad because suddenly they're under attack by armed freakers and Nero, and and then things are happening with Sarah where she has to continue her research. Deacon promised her that he was going to help her with that, and in order to do that, they have to move west. So the whole second game would not have taken place in the same place, but it would have been in Western Oregon, which I don't know if you know anything about that, but that's where I grew up. So I was really looking forward to exploring the Rogue Valley, which has some incredible landscape features. It's got the Willamette Valley, which has got the I-5 corridor, and what a disaster area that would have been. And then, of course, the Oregon coast. So yeah, there would have been a lot of really, and in bigger urban centers, right? So we had a couple of urban centers, but they weren't very big. But I could imagine, being, what the outskirts of Portland might look like, or even Eugene. I mean, that would have been really cool.
Yeah. Do you think any of these ideas will survive in some form in, future projects that you're working on?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because not these specific ideas, but I learned so much writing Days Gone because, when we started that game, none of us had maybe there was a couple of people on the team that had done open world, but certainly Jeff and I didn't. And, we were just kind of making it up as we went along. And all I could do was base the writing on, other open world games I had played. And so, I learned I learned the hard way because I wasn't entirely successful at it. Like pacing, I think, was the biggest issue that I probably would have changed if I had it to do over again. And something that, now for Asphalt, I know exactly how that works. So I work in a 3-act structure. In Act 1, it's just supposed to set up, get you to the catalyst and get you propelled into the main story. And we didn't realize how long Act 1 was in the first playthrough of Days Gone until Jeff was the first person to beat the game, right? It's still really rough, a lot of pieces missing, but it was fully playable for the first time. And I think Act 1 took something like 22 hours, which is ridiculous, right? So it's like the current version I think that we shipped with was down to 6 if you skipped a bunch of open world stuff. But anyway, so learning the pacing of the game and how do you create enough story and keep these beats moving along, that was all valuable information that I would have taken right into the sequel and that I'm bringing into Ashfall. The other big one is just, we talked a little bit about Deacon's storyline, but for an open world game, and I feel pretty strongly about this, you need more than one storyline, and that's why it may seem a little convoluted at first, unless you really play the game and pay attention. But you're following the Deacon and Boozer storyline, which is, hey, is Boozer going to live or die? Right? He has this horrible act of violence done to him. He's going to lose the arm. He might die. He's got to get antibiotics. That whole storyline, and then his sort of mental health as you're playing through the game. That's one storyline, and I bounce between that to what is arguably the most important storyline, which is Deacon looking for his wife, and that all involves the O'Brien missions, right? So you're trying to do favors for Nero, so O'Brien will give you information about Sarah, and so that takes you all the way through the end of the game, and then Act 2 ends with the Carlos storyline. So Deacon and Boozer's history with the club, they discover their history with Jesse's involved, and that becomes part of the storyline of Deacon and Iron Mike, which is evidently before the game started, Deacon was kind of an asshole, selling people to Tucker, for example, people like Lisa, and then it was like the Lisa storyline that kind of, I think, changed Deacon in an important way. He began, it's like, hey, she reminds me of my wife's sister. What am I doing? Why am I dealing with Tucker? And so that became, anyway, these are all different storylines that all have beats that kind of interweave and intersect. And that kind of storytelling is really only possible in a large open world game where the player has the freedom to move back and forth between them and, go to different locales to pick up this story thread. It became a problem for some of our early focus testers because it is a lot to follow, right? So for Ashfall, I've kind of figured out some ways to mitigate that. But in Days Gone, we came up with this, sort of a Netflix screen that allows you to track all the stories. It's like, hey, here's Lisa. When's the last time I saw her? Right? Or, I can't remember all the titles I gave the storylines, but they all have they all have threads that you can follow. And we had to create this interface screen that I stole the idea from Netflix in order to help the player keep track of it all. So for Ashfall, no specific ideas from Days Gone, but the kinds of things that I think make an open world game fun and exciting.
You mentioned in the past that Deacon's story about his dad telling him to drown a rat's nest came from a personal experience in your own life. Were there any other personal experiences that you included in the story?
Yeah, so my writing tends to be very autobiographical. The scene with the hose and the rats, that actually happened. That's real. Copeland is real. It's like I grew up with a guy like that. My mom worked for him. My mom was the secretary of one of the country's first Second Amendment groups. So, you think MAGA is kind of out there politically. When I grew up in Southern Oregon in Medford, no, dude, it was that times 10 because everybody was a gun nut. Everybody was super ultra conservative. I mean, the kind of conservatives that are like Ammon Bundy, who go to war against the federal government. Those kinds of conservatives, right? So a lot of the speeches that Copeland gives you, I've heard that rhetoric my entire life, or at least when I was growing up in Medford. So that kind of stuff was very common. I'm just, one of the reasons why, we have talked about this before is the setting, right? So why set this in the high desert of Oregon? And it's because, I'm looking for, things that I know personally. So I grew up here, came out this way a lot of times, spent a lot of time hiking and adventuring in, these mountains and woods when I was a kid. So a lot of that kind of thing comes from, and I'm not the only one. There's, a bunch of the dudes that been in studio and gals have direct experience with some of the kinds of places you see in the game. So that certainly played a huge part of it. I'm sure there's a bunch of examples that I can't think of right off the top of my head, but to answer your question, yes, there were a lot.
Talking about Copeland, one of the things that brings the world to life are the different personalities of the various camp leaders. It seems like they are meticulously crafted to play off each other and explore different political structures or ideologies. What was the world building process like? And how much fun did you have creating such a detailed and rich world?
Well, yeah, it was very, very deliberate. So the way the story came about is I work from a detailed outline, and I use a variety of sort of Hollywood structure that kind of can guide like important story beats. So when I wrote the initial story, I knew important. I called it the golden path. So it's the backbone of when you're playing the main storyline missions.
Mhm.
So I wrote this outline that basically started with Deacon and Sarah and Boozer in Farewell as it's blowing up, and then ends with them, riding away from Wizard Island. And every single important beat in the game was part of that outline, including all the camps he goes to, because
Mm.
that's an important part of the experience. So, and one of the things that I think could really use more exploration for game developers to discuss, like how do you craft narrative in games in general, not just open world games, but the keys are having interesting places to wander around it, to look and see, just basically it's like theme park design. Hey, I got to think about not just the characters that are going to be there, but what makes this space interesting, right? Like why, how is Copeland's camp going to be different than Tucker's camp and Iron Mike's or the militia? And so that goes into it. And then it's got to be in different parts of the world, right? So, I got to have a hub in this part of the world, and it's got to be a place where, Deacon's got to go and buy and sell stuff, obviously, but he's got to meet new characters there, and they're going to develop new missions. So it's the geography of it. It's like you mentioned, the politics of it. I had a spreadsheet where I had listed out all the camps in the game, and there was an entire camp that got cut, by the way. I think.
Oh, really? What was
Yeah.
that one?
So in Act 3 used to be about twice as big as it is now. And it was by the time we got there, we just realized, oh, this is just too much. It's too much. So when you had James McCune on, and he was talking about, yeah, there was this like football player who was running a camp, but there was a whole much bigger drug storyline.
Mm.
And there was a whole camp south of Crater Lake, kind of on the opposite, at the very, very south end of the map. And a whole new region down there to explore, because man, that's a gorgeous part of Oregon, and there's a lot of farmland down there. And so again, it was an interesting biome that was different than what we had in other parts of the game, but just too much. So the spreadsheet though showed where each of these camps were politically, right? So obviously Tucker's camp is kind of an autocracy, and it's run, it's kind of the fact that she was a prison warden or a prison matron gives that whole thing kind of a vibe to it that is very unique, right? And Copeland, we've talked about, he's the I think the freedom first, don't tread on me dude. And Iron Mike, I think, is the one who's probably the most normal. But I think, as it turns out, and I've said this before, it's like, the conflict between Skizzo and Iron Mike. Skizzo's not wrong. Iron Mike is kind of a fool, and it's like, I think that there's a kind of expediency that would need to happen to help that camp survive, and making deals with the Rippers probably isn't it.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, that's the camp I would live in, right? It's like,
Right.
he believes in democracy and justice, and he's not an autocrat. You're free to leave if you want to, all that.
Yeah.
And then the militia, of course, is just kind of not straight up military. And I wish more people had picked up on that, because I actually think the colonel's kind of a good guy too, if you really look at what his goals are and what he wants. I mean, he turns out to be kind of a bastard, but some of those early speeches he gives to the new recruits, where he's like, he's very inclusive, right?
He is, yeah. He's like, everyone is welcome, and he talks a lot about, preserving the best parts of civilization, education, information, science. He is very progressive.
Yes, exactly.
Then it takes a very dark turn.
He does, yes. But each one of those camps did have, therefore, its own view on how to save the world, what it was going to take to survive, and I think they contrasted with each other fairly well.
Let's talk about character creation. At the beginning of the game, Deacon is a damaged man on the verge of losing his humanity. He's trading with a slave camp. He kills people for money. What led to the decision to have such a dark character, so sorely in need of redemption, as our main character?
Oh well, I'll tell you this. He used to be a lot darker than he is now. I ended up having to go back, and we ended up editing, all of the Act One cutscenes and some storylines because it was hinted at that Lisa was sold into slavery, right? But there were much darker undertones to that. Like she actually, when she reunites with Deacon, actually just goes into I think a much stronger sort of speech about look at what you did to me, kind of thing. And again, dude, I think this is a hard lesson I learned that is applicable only to long games with 20, 30, 50-hour narratives. If you're writing a movie, and I know you're a screenwriter, so you must know this, you can have an unlikable character, right? Because in a movie, you got to get from, like, I think one of my favorite movies from the last few years is Tom Cruise in The Edge of Tomorrow. And he's such an unlikable character at the start of that movie. He's arrogant, he's lazy, he's a coward. He does everything and then he's forced into this battlefield, and he's forced to live his assholeness over and over and over again until it's kind of beaten out of him. So in a 2-hour movie, you can do that. You can't do that in a 60-hour game because players don't want to spend 8 hours with Deacon if he's an asshole.
Right.
And the feedback I got from that was just kind of overwhelming. And man, early focus test, people just hated Deacon. He was just like, he was insufferable. And so all that had to be toned down. So yes, what I really wanted, and I do feel strongly about this, you want a character, who's got, at least the way I write characters for the main character, they got to have some kind of an arc, right? You got to start them somewhere, and they're broken in some way, and then over the course of the story, they figure out how to fix it, and maybe use that weakness as a strength, and all that typical standard stuff. But for a 60-hour game, you just got to be careful about how there's other ways to make your character, and here's the other thing: you can't make him weak either, right? Because it's an action game. So you don't want the player running around, as all wimpy for 4 or 5 hours either. So it's a challenge. But yeah, I felt he has this history. And I haven't for a couple of years, but I used to watch the YouTube videos of people playing and reacting to the game. And man, it's like every time I always looked forward to the scenes where they finally get to, the big Carlos reveal. And you learn really what kind of a dick Boozer and Deacon were back in the day, right? I mean, they held a dude down while his tats were burned off. There's really kind of no excuse for that. And that was a scene I kind of had to fight to keep, because it's like, yeah, I know, I get it, but that's real evidence that the Deacon we see now is not who he was, when he was back in a full-blown member of the MC.
Yeah, he's a changed man. I had a quick question for you about Carlos. What was it that he did that warranted getting the tats burned off? Because there's a few different conflicting sources on the internet, and the art book is kind of vague. What is the actual, did he kill someone in the MC or something like that?
To be honest, I didn't have a lot of help writing the game, but I had a lot of help writing some of the backstory and side story stuff. So a writer named Ann Toole, who's I think she just won a WGA award, has gone on to do some great things with Horizon. She wrote all that Carlos backstory for the game. And I definitely remember that it was related to drugs. He did murder somebody. He murdered somebody in the MC. But it was worse than that. He almost got the entire MC arrested because of the way he was dealing drugs on the side and without permission. So he went against the bylaws. He threatened the entire club. He got a person killed. Just overall, I wouldn't in any way see he had it coming. But the way bikers work, yeah, he could have been murdered. So
yeah. Let's talk about Boozer. Boozer's one of a lot of players' favorite characters. There's a lot of love for Boozman. What went into creating him as a character to sort of play off of Deacon and Deacon's arc?
Let me get to that in a second, because I have one more just little bit of trivia for you.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I remember somewhere on your podcast, someone was discussing where the name Carlos came from, And again, that was all from Anne. It's because once Jesse was kicked out of the club, he went on this, hallucinogenic sort of tour and lost his mind and dove into the books of Carlos Castaneda. And that's where he started getting these ideas about becoming a messiah figure and leading people to safety. And, and then when the Freaker outbreak happened, that just sort of confirmed in his mind. And again, I don't think much of this made it into the game. Maybe it's in backstory docs somewhere, but that was the backstory that Anne wrote for him.
Oh, cool.
Another writing tool I had was this wheel that I built, and the wheel has Deacon in the center, and every aspect of his personality is reflected in some other important character. I think there's 20 characters in the game that have significant screen time, and every one of them is an aspect of who Deacon is. And, I'm not saying that's the only way to write a character or the best way, even. It's probably not, but that's how I do it, because I really want, in order for there to be really good tension, I want there to be important elements of everybody around him that either reflects or challenges some part of his own personality. And so Boozer obviously is, very early on, what they have in common is their brotherhood, their friendship. They're all each other has. And so, that family, I guess, and brotherhood, and the brotherhood of one of the things that I find most interesting about bike culture is they all feel that way, and it's very real. And so they will die for their brothers, no matter what. It's almost like, people who survived the military together, they have this closeness built in. Mm-hmm. But that gets challenged, right? Because Boozer also has that sort of macho biker thing going on, like the scene where, and this was a scene that came from Jeff Ross, by the way. I think it was his best contribution to the story, is the scene where they just had to, put down the dog, and they're, and they just, Boozer went on a rampage, killed a bunch of rippers, and he, at that point, Boozer's just kind of fed up with Deacon moping around because Boozer's convinced Sarah's gone, and he's just, basically just tells, because Deacon just got the bad news from O'Brien that no, Sarah's gone, and Boozer's like, dude, she's been gone for 2 years, what the fuck? And so, he just kind of beats the crap out of him, and that's that kind of biker thing. That's the minus side of it, right? The plus side of it is your brother's forever, but the minus side of it is I will kick your ass if I think you're doing something dumb.
Yeah, I'll call you out on your shit.
Exactly. So that's where Boozer kind of came from. And, I think I love that character. It turns out he's really a popular character, which kind of surprised me, but, nothing will surprise me anymore.
And then, of course, there's Sarah, who I've described before as perhaps the video game industry's strongest female character. Can you talk a little bit about what went into creating her?
Yeah, she, in a weird way, she kind of created herself, because one of the things as a writer that I try to do is go against expectations, try to surprise people, try to, if you think what's going to happen, try to find a way to subvert that in some way. And, definitely with Sarah, I think that, she, number one, she plays an important role in the plot, right? So if I had that to do over again, I might have made that less sort of clumsy. But, I thought making her a scientist and a botanist would throw people off the track enough that she couldn't have had anything to do with the virus. But people figured that out pretty quickly. But still, wanting to have a smart character, I guess, is what I would say. Because, again, Deacon, the trope and the stereotype is you think of bikers and you think they're dumb. They're just big blue-collar brutes that have, no college education and whatever. But I think Deacon makes it pretty clear that he may not have a college education, but he's a pretty smart dude. Mm-hmm. And he's a smart ass, and he's able to challenge her. But at the same time, Sarah's very intelligent, does have all these degrees, and, has been working as a scientist for a long time. But, sometimes things kind of go right over her head, and, she doesn't have, the same sense of humor that Deacon does. So right. I think what she reflects in Deacon, I think, is a way to challenge his intellect and a way to, challenge pretty much everything about him, and still, kind of come in a package that, is appealing to him, right? So I had, so that's why, Sarah has tattoos and she's not afraid. And, she's more than just what the plot needs her to be, which I think is really important if you want to develop a character for any medium, let alone just games. They've got to have their own life and they got to have their own goals, and then you learn by the time you get to the end of the game, you learn obviously that she's got some pretty big secrets of her own that explain a lot of her distance and behavior. Even in the flashbacks, I don't know if people have picked up on it, but like the scene where they're proposing, and she has to take that call and run off.
Mm-hmm.
That was the start of the zombie apocalypse, and it's like from that point on, I think even if Deacon hadn't put her on that chopper, there would have been huge problems between them because she felt so guilty and responsible for everything.
Timeline-wise, question for you. When she gets that call, when you have the proposal scene, you said that's the beginning of the zombie apocalypse. Is that, like, how close in time is that to when you have David Gorman, the intern who stole a sample of the virus and leaked it and caused the outbreak? Are those two things happening kind of at the same time, or is there time in between them?
Dude, that is a really good question. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer. So this is a trick. This is a trick I learned from Amy Hennig when I was writing Uncharted Golden Abyss, because I would pepper her with these kinds of questions, right? Because when I was working on the script for that, and I didn't work really closely with Amy, but closely enough where I could, talk to her once a week. And I was trying to find, in the early days, a hook for a story, right? Because we knew we had to kind of do a prequel because Naughty Dog didn't want us sort of taking up any story beats that they might want to use later for later stories. So I knew what I was working with, but I would ask these questions about Drake's life, and she didn't know the answers because she's like, and this is the tip she gave me. She's like, as a writer, don't write anything down until you have to. Don't put down a time or a date or, a relationship until you need it, because otherwise you're locked in from that point on. So I never did figure out the timeline between Gorman and when all that stuff went down versus when do these three people find themselves in farewell with the world burning around them. I never wrote that timeline down because I didn't need it. Now if I were ever going to do any more work in it, because I am doing that, believe me, in much more detail in Asphalt, because I think it saves a bunch of time later on and make sure that I have internal consistency. So for Days Gone, I think it worked out pretty well not knowing all of that. A lot, and here's another answer is that if you've picked up all of the intel that's in the game that's available, and you get these little recordings by people that were out in the field, there's a few storylines in there too that pick up some of those details. Like you learn when did the the death strains first start running, or when did they start putting in the mass graves? And if somebody wanted to, because I don't have time to do it, but somebody could piece together a timeline of the entire Days Gone story, and it would stretch back to when Deacon and Sarah started dating.
Yeah. Do you have any story written, or did you have any story in mind for the interim between Sarah getting on the chopper and her meeting back up with Deacon? Like any Sarah specific story?
Yeah, I think most of that made it into the game. I'm pretty sure it did, right? So the broad outline is that she's supposed to go to this one camp, but that got diverted. And that's why, Deacon thinks that she's gone, is because he gets to that camp and it's just a massacre. Mm-hmm. So then she ends up out in the salt flats east of Crater Lake, and Nero had a big camp out there. And another example of an area of the game that got cut, by the way, because at one point in the plan, you were supposed to be able to go all the way out there and explore that camp, which had also been overrun, and get more clues. But again, it was just, scope-wise, it was just too much. But yeah, so she spends time out there, and then she's part of the group that gets evacuated to the Highway 97 corridor, and then those freaks come in, and at that point, she gets swept up with the militia. And then because of her expertise, that's the way the Colonel works, right? It's like, if you've got something you can contribute, then I'll put you to work.
Right.
And that's when she saw her chance to start, working on a plan to find a cure.
Yeah. A lot of people don't get the nuance, the depth and the subtext of the reunion between Deacon and Sarah. She doesn't seem grateful, is a common complaint, or she should have swooned into his arms, and so on and so on. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's like I'll say a couple of things. One is it's exactly written and directed as I intended. I didn't have to cut anything with that. I thought that Courtney and Sam did an amazing job with the performances because and also, by the way, the tech team don't get enough credit for the motion capture team and the facial capture team and the audio and the music. Dude, to pull that scene off at all, because there's a lot of nuance going on in their faces, is tough to do if you're not an actor, with a camera pointed at you. So to do it in 3D is kind of amazing. So anyway, it worked as intended. And to be honest, I was, again, it starts from a place of not wanting to do what people expect. Of course, you want her to swoon into his arms. But if that happens, then you've already predicted what it was going to happen. And to me, there's no entertainment in that. The entertainment comes in being surprised and being frustrated and having, being challenged. It's like I wanted players to get to that scene and expect the tearful reunion. And when they didn't get it, I think that was what that was my intent. Is that I wanted to have them feel something very different than what they were expecting.
Yeah. Well,
and boy, that worked. So dude, if I had to do it again, you know what I would have done? Because the problem was, again, because if you look at the problems with storytelling in video games, the cutscene cannot last forever, right? Some of my cutscenes, as a rule, just so you know, I tried to keep my cutscenes to a minute each, which is basically one page of script, and some go like a page and a half. If it goes longer than that, it's like I feel like it's a game, it's not a movie, so you want enough story there and enough stuff that can't be done well in gameplay, at least in my opinion. But you want to keep it short and sweet, so all my cutscenes are like very, very short, except the long ones, right? So this is actually a pretty long cutscene as it is. And you've just gotten through with a long walk and talk with the Colonel, right? So by this point, players who aren't, that much into the narrative are already sort of tapping their toes on the ground, going, okay, come on, let's speed this up. So in other words, I don't know what else I could have done, because in real life, here's what would have happened. In real life, Sarah would have done exactly what she did, which is pretend she didn't know him, and then found a way very quickly to pull them aside and have a heart-to-heart, like, do that kind of thing where you're patting each other down, like, is this you? Is this real? And just kind of have that, I think a more realistic reunion could have been done, but it would have taken way too much time. So I just chose to not deal with it then and have it play out over the next few missions.
I think that was a perfect decision, perfect answer to, to keep it moving and to keep players involved and keep people guessing, keep people wanting to have them be together. Because if you deliver on what people want, well, then why keep playing the game? I got what I wanted.
Exactly. And I just think it was interesting. For me, I entertained myself while I was writing it, and I love the character of Corey, because again, he kind of goes against your expectations. It's like, at first you're maybe wondering, hey, is he having an affair with my wife? He's got my ring. What the fuck, And then he's like, turns out to be a good guy. Turns out to be one of the best good guys in the game. And again, I hope that was all kind of unexpected, because I don't think people were expecting that turn from him.
Right. Well, actually, that was going to be my next question. I do have a few story-specific questions that have been long debated among players, and I know people would kill me if I didn't ask the clarification from the man himself. Why did Captain Corey have Sarah's ring?
I think that was explained in the game too. Maybe not.
No, it's not in there.
It's been almost 5 years, so
you can kind of, there's the explanation
at, right?
Jewelry is taken off you when you join.
Yeah, so you saw that happen. So this is how I explained it. I did it visually through the experience. It's like, the one woman is super upset when her jewelry's being taken, and so you see that they have, and then the it's explained why, no, you got to give up all your jewelry, all that stuff. And so then I imagine, and again, I didn't write this down, but I imagine that's where Corey got it. He's like looking through, they're getting ready to smelt this stuff down. Hey, this is a pretty cool looking ring. I think I'll hang on to this one. I think it was just as simple as that.
So it's just sort of officer privilege. He's kind of allowed to wear jewelry, even though everyone else is not supposed to.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, another story-specific question. Was Schizo actually a gangbanger, or was that just what he wanted people to think?
That's just what he wanted people to think. Now, I know there was backstory written for this. I thought it was I think it kind of got turned into Deacon and Boozer sort of joking about Schizo Deacon was talking about in one of his visits to Sarah's memorial stone.
Yeah.
And I definitely, think that had a lot of truth to it. So I picture Schizo as being, a low-level office dude, an executive maybe, who's working, at Farmers Insurance or whatever. And then the apocalypse happens and, he sort of transforms himself into a tough guy to survive, right? So it takes on this persona of somebody who's a lot tougher than he really is.
Yeah. Why are the characters not at risk of infection, even though the virus was airborne? Are they immune?
I don't think I say anywhere that the virus is airborne. I don't think that's a fact.
Okay, that may be an assumption on my part. I know that there's but it's the thing about David Gorman takes the sample to the expo in Portland, and and then everyone flies home from there and spreads it.
That's
so
right.
I'm assuming airborne is.
That's right. Yes. No, you're absolutely right. So again, this is a part of the backstory that Anne helps me write, and because she had done a bunch of research into the evolution of viruses, as we're seeing right now, by the way, with COVID. Like how many deltas are we up to now?
Oh yeah.
So just sort of postulating, that it was an aerosol in its earlier stages, but then it evolved very quickly after the first few months into something that could only be transmitted via blood and saliva.
Okay. So follow-up question: is Deacon at risk of getting infected if he's like fighting the freaks and there's blood and saliva flying around, or if he gets bitten or something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think we could have probably made that more clear, but when you lose a fight, when you're fighting the freakers hand to hand, it fades to black and you're dead, and the assumption there is you got bit or you were exposed and you were going to die a horrible death. We made a decision very early on, and I'm trying to remember why we made this decision. Early on, I had written out some scenes where you're holding a dude. The only one we ended up keeping in the game was the newt, right? That Sarah's trying to cure. So that's and even then we're not seeing her transform. We're seeing her die. Although she doesn't really die. I'll tell you about that. That was a sequel idea I had. But we never showed a transformation, not once. And it was originally there was a scene where you were going to watch a dude who came in and got bitten, and then you see him turn. And I'm trying to remember why I think we ended up cutting it out because it was, kind of a trope that because Walking Dead was a huge show at that time, and they played up that stuff a lot, right? That show was all about these characters getting infected, and in fact, every plot point for like the first 4 seasons sort of turned on that. And I think that was one reason I just kind of avoided those storylines. So that simple answer is yes, Deacon will get bitten in turn, but we don't show it. We just fade to black.
That makes sense. At what point in the story did O'Brien get infected?
So early on, we had the only time you see O'Brien's face is at the very end and at the very beginning.
Right.
And I made the choice, and dude, it was a hard choice to make because I don't know if you got to see Bernardo's face while you were talking to him on his interview, but the dude is super expressive. I mean, he's a great actor, but he acts with every part of his body. And so O'Brien's facial performance capture throughout that entire game was amazing. The players never got to see it.
Oh, such a shame. He is such a good actor. He's incredible.
See, like the scene where, in fact, some of O'Brien's scenes are some of my favorite scenes in the game, because the scenes where O'Brien is, reacting to, Deacon pulling a gun on him and saying, you were at my wife. Why are you alive and not her? And he just started, and O'Brien just loses it, right? That's a great scene. Or the scene where O'Brien's telling him that his wife died, or,
right.
And then, of course, the end when there's the big reveal. O'Brien, just an amazing actor, or Bernardo, just an amazing actor, and could do a lot of cool things with his face. Another quick bit of trivia. He also had some really, because when you're on the set and you've written a scene and you get it on its feet and you're acting, sometimes little bits of it just don't work out. And man, good actors will help you in that moment solve a story problem. Like, for example, when we were shooting the rooftop scene at the very start of the game, and he's putting Sarah on that chopper, there's this kind of awkward transition where, Deacon runs over to Boozer and says, "Hey, brother, we got to go." He's like, "I heard what he said. There's not room for all of us, so I'm going to stay here." And then Deacon goes back and is saying goodbye to Sarah. And O'Brien comes up and goes, "Are you coming?" And originally, there was this kind of awkward moment where Deacon was, going to basically have to say no. And O'Brien, Bernardo is the one who made the suggestion that, what if Sarah says no? That made it more powerful, and it made it a better moment, right? Yeah. It made her stronger. It made her not the damsel being put on the helicopter to be taken away, but it made her the one making a choice to save both of them. So where did he turn? Again, I don't 100% know. All I know is that when we were shooting those scenes with Bernardo, I just kind of told him, I showed him the art because I had that on a spreadsheet as well. And I said, "Here, you're not infected at all, and you're 100% infected. So we're going to play you a little bit weirder in each scene, as if you're slowly becoming whatever the virus is doing to you. So that by the time you get to those scenes in Act 3 where Deacon is, sent into the cave to try to find the dude who was, killed down there, and O'Brien feels really guilty for sending those guys to their deaths. Mm-hmm. So you just feel the tension in O'Brien's voice then. And, and again, I love one of my favorite lines in the game is, the one where, he and Deacon are having a fight, and O'Brien just basically tells him, he's like, maybe this time when the chopper comes, you'll get on. Right. It's just, I laughed when I wrote that line, and I laugh every time I hear it. But
that's a good line.
Just like, I think that there's you can tell that there's so much tension in O'Brien by that point. And certainly his hinting way earlier, when he's hinting by, when he tells Deacon things like, "Hey, we may look like we're all one big happy family, but we're not. That's why I'm spying on these guys, because I'm cut out of the information. I don't know what's going on." So, even though Brian himself might not have been infected by then, I think it's pretty obvious that the higher ups at Nero and a bunch of other subgroups in Nero might have been.
Yeah, or O'Brien's like worried about, maybe he knows someone is infecting people, or maybe he knows someone who was infected by Nero, and he's like, "Oh shit, am I next? Is this going to happen to me? Like, what's happening?"
Yes, and all of that would have been explored way, way further in the sequel. At least in my version, what would that have been? Because again, I think that's an important relationship, is Deacon and O'Brien. I think they've now bonded over, what they've gone through. And I think there was just, I think it's a super interesting relationship. And I think that there's a lot more that could be done with that.
Was the Colonel in a relationship with Doc Jimenez?
Yeah. What's super interesting about that is, I think, because the text is now out there in the world, and everybody's opinion is as valid as mine, because I'll tell you this much, I did not write that intentionally. But when I first heard this theory, I said, yeah, that makes perfect sense, because the Colonel kind of takes a heel turn after Doc dies.
Right.
And there's this scene that I wrote where, the Colonel is very solicitous in a way that goes beyond, I think, a military leader trying to protect valued assets. So that was not my intent when I wrote it, but I can definitely see why people see that. And if I'm going to be honest, I wish I had intentionally written it that way. But maybe I would have overdone it, right? Because here's the thing. I don't know if you noticed this in the game, but I'm very careful with writing about groups that I'm not a member of. As a writer, you should be able to write gay stories or, ethnic stories or whatever. And I just feel uncomfortable doing that for some reason. I'm not, I'm just not going to do it. So another thing that you probably noticed is that race plays no part in this game.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a deliberate choice, because I didn't want to, again, I've seen this I saw it in Sons of Anarchy, and I saw it in Walking Dead, where I think probably in an apocalypse, race would be a very important part of that world in a very negative way. And I just kind of wanted to avoid it. I didn't want to spend hours and hours writing scenes about racists and, all that kind of ugliness and hatred. I just didn't want to do it. And so the same kind of thing with, with people's lives. And I can't remember who I told this last time I was talking about the game, but it's basically, I try to write every person as if they're just a person. And, and that's why I literally have zero problem with, the current trend of having multi-ethnic casting for, even like in Hamilton, you've got Jefferson is played by a black dude. I love that because yes, the real Jefferson was not that, but hey, you know what? It makes for an interesting story, makes for an interesting stage play. And so I kind of write that same way. I'm like, yeah, Jefferson could be whatever.
Right.
And I don't focus on that part of it.
What part of Days Gone are you the most proud of?
Well, are we talking about just the game as a whole, or like specific to my contribution, or narrow that down for me?
The game as a whole, or however you want to answer it. But the product that was put out. What do you look at and you're like, yeah, I'm the most proud of that part.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've never been asked that before, believe it or not. Let me see if I can come up with a good answer. I mean, I'll just think out loud for a minute. So, when I think back on like the first reveals and some of the things that because don't forget, we were a very small team. Even when we were near shipping, we were only 50 people internally, and we were making something that most studios had minimum of 150 people. So that we were able to make anything is kind of a miracle. So, dude, I just remember when the world itself kind of came online, and that was all the work of concept artists and the technical art team and engineering. But man, I don't think players have any idea, because again, we're talking like, it's been 5 years since the game came out, and probably 4 years before that. So going on 10 years, the technology, even though we were using Unreal 4, those guys rewrote all of that code to create that world. So the world, I get long-winded way of saying the world itself, I think is just spectacular. And then when those guys came in, the environment team came in and added, originally we had just sort of a skybox with flowing clouds in it. And then, we would populate a storm if we needed one. And they just came in and built a full-blown weather system where if you could watch the snow clouds come in and it would start snowing, and the snow would start piling up. And then you can watch the clouds go away and the snow melts and turns into water puddles. I mean, little details like that are super, super hard to do. And especially then, and man, it creates so much ambience. I think probably another thing that I had very little to do with, but except directing it, was the music. I think the soundtrack by Nathan Whitehead
my God, yes.
is a revelation.
Yeah.
And, I always feel this way about every game I've worked on, and I've worked with some amazing musical talent like Azam Ali. If you don't know her, look her up. She helped us with the soundtrack to Logan Shadow. Great music. And Nathan Whitehead was the best, so we auditioned a few different composers, and I don't remember which piece Nathan shared with us first, but I think it was Sarah's theme, or maybe it was the Days Gone theme. And, it's what I look for in music. I want a melody that haunts me, and I want something, that's going to make me feel something. And the same thing with like the song we commissioned from Billy Raphael, right? And Louis Capaldi at the end. Those are amazing songs. And, even if they had nothing to do with Days Gone, but the fact that they wrote it for this experience and it's unique to this experience is pretty amazing. So the music, the world, it's like, I'm impressed by the acting. Dude, Sam Witwer killed it. Courtney Draper. We haven't talked about Ricky yet, but man, it's like all the main characters, I thought, brought it and created unique voices and characters that were believable. And like in Taylor's case, heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. There was a lot that I think that the team especially can be super proud of.
Sony Pictures Entertainment is currently developing a movie adaptation of the game. What do you make of that? How do you feel about that?
Well, number one, I think it's awesome because, we're hoping to get HBO to adapt Asphalt. So I'm all for any kind of exposure for an IP that I've had anything to do with. Even though I'm not going to have anything to do with the movie, if they make it into a movie, then the fans have got to be thrilled because, then there's going to be a chance there might be a sequel someday, right? If it becomes super successful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I think it's awesome. It's like, do I wish do I wish I could make some money from that? That would be nice. But dude, that's just the way games works, right? So it's like one of the things that I would like to see changed in the game industry is, sort of abolishing the work for hire contract system, which I've worked under my entire career. And I get it. I understand why they are that way because the comics industry was the same way. Hollywood isn't that way though. In Hollywood, if you Craig Mazin pitches a show about The Last of Us and then they pick it up and turn it into a movie, Craig Mazin, the writer with Neil Druckmann of The Last of Us, is going to get paid for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to have credit. He's going to be assured that he gets story by Craig Mazin or whatever. Those are assurances built into the guild that they have, right? The union. And the game industry doesn't have that, and I wish it did. So that's my only caveat is just on a very selfish level. I wish that I could participate in that in some way. But having said that, I wish them all the success, man. Like I said, it's like if they can make a Days Gone movie and have it be a hit, that would be pretty incredible.
All right, you mentioned Ashfall, and I've been dying to ask you about it. This is the game you're currently developing alongside The Last of Us executive Michael Mumbauer. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so I mentioned that once I left Sony, I spent a few weeks sort of being shell-shocked and trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do. And I took a year and wrote this hardback book about Carl Barks, who's an artist I've been following, for 50 years now. And then I just started, I started playing with Unity and built a couple of very small games. And I started thinking about, because I told you I had been writing down notes about what I would have done in the sequel. And I knew that I didn't own the rights to Days Gone, so I wasn't going to be able to do anything with that. So I finished my first novel, which is it's a young adult novel based about a non-Christian view of the afterlife. And that was a lot of fun. And that kind of got me going and saying, what would I do if I could write another open world game? What have I learned from Days Gone? What have I learned since then that I could pour into a new project, new IP? And so I started working on Asphalt, and it was just an idea I had, right? The ideas are kind of like all projects at the beginning, they're kind of all over the place. But Ash coalesced very quickly. So he's a character who's also broken at the beginning for physical reasons. He's born without arms, he's born without an eye, and we're 1,000 years in the future, but it's still in the Pacific Northwest, only further north. And he's, the volcanoes are all active, and these mysterious pockets of dark energy have popped up all over the Earth. There's no zombies in this game, but there are lots of mutated animals because there's this inexplicable mystery thing going on that, we'll explore and explain over the course of the game, which I'm also thinking of as a trilogy, by the way. But the character of Ash is just kind of like, hey, he gets these implants from his parents because they're part of this group. There's this huge sort of schism between people who blame because the whole world is being sort of destroyed by global warming, which I don't know if you've seen this series on, I think it's on Apple TV. I'm not sure. It's called Extrapolation, which is
I haven't seen that one.
It's pretty good. And it's basically about global warming in our time and how it's going to destroy us in the next 100 years. And that's kind of what I do is I extrapolate that all into the future. Anyway, so getting back to Ash, it's kind of an origin story for somebody who grows through all of what he has to go through and becomes kind of a superhero. So for me, it was a genre that I hadn't really seen before. It's because, again, thinking about gameplay first, it's all about the technology and what he's going to do as he gets these new implants in his arms that, are kind of like Iron Man, but way more, geared towards gameplay. And then, on a personal level, how he's going to grow and overcome all the challenges that he faces. So, I just started writing, and then I was pitching it because I was creating a deck, a PowerPoint deck as I was working on it. I pitched it to Mike Mumbauer because he was working on That's No Moon at the time. And, you know, he and I had gotten to be pretty close because he was, you know, sort of encouraged me to, you know, try to find companies that would do a startup or whatever, because he was going through all that himself. And so I would pitch this to him, and he remembered it. And then when he left That's No Moon a year later, he basically said, "Hey, that asphalt deck, you still have that?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm still actually working on it." And I told him everything. I gave him the pitch again, gave him everything I'd done. And that's when we just started talking about doing Lethos and making it into a game. And I really liked his vision for what, you know, how he does IP, because it's not just a game, it's a world. And the world, you know, like I just finished writing the first 6 issues of a miniseries in the Asphalt comic book. And so in fact he just mailed me the printed paper copies, so I haven't seen those yet, but the artwork is amazing. The colors, the lettering, everything about it is just crazy good. And that was just so much fun to, you know, suddenly I'm working on comics, which, you know, is very different than writing a novel and very different than writing a game, even though they have some things in common. It was a way to sort of visually approach the experience while not having to put in the expense of creating the game itself. So it's just been a blast. I've been having so much fun doing that, and I'm writing the game itself, right? So I'm at that stage where I've got the golden path outlined for the entire game. I kind of know what the sequels are going to be, and, you know, I know what Ash's story arc is going to be.
Do you have an expected release date? Too soon to say, or
too soon to say? So what I love about the process that we're in right now is that, you know, I'm working with concept artists and I'm writing, and we have a small tech team, and they're working on core features of the engine. But, you know, I got to tell you, with Days Gone, it was hard in some ways, because, you know, if you're writing for like a television series and you need new episodes done now, and they're in production and filming, that's a terrible place to be, because then you're constantly under pressure to create and write content while, you know, the team is waiting for it. So I'm glad I don't have to do that. I'm glad I can, you know, I've got all the time I need to flesh this thing out and get it right, and, you know, just write it, and, you know, and experiment with it. Like, I love how, like, the other thing I did is I did a motion comic using Unity of the first issue, and it was just a lot of fun, because, again, the motion comic is using the same story and the same material, but it's a very different medium. And so, you know, getting hands-on in the tool is something I would not be able to do if we were in full production on the game.
Yeah.
So ETA, yeah, I don't know. As soon as possible. It's what I would say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't wait to find out more about it, to eventually play it. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be absolutely awesome.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, John, I have a couple final questions.
Sure.
First of all, I'm sure you're aware that Days Gone has an incredibly loyal and passionate fan base. Is there anything you'd like to say to the fans of Days Gone?
You know, I think the only thing I really have to say is thank you, because, man, it's really, really, really heartening and makes it all worthwhile when you've got players that respond, you know, even if they respond negatively, and trust me, I've gotten plenty of that. You know, if you've played the game and you have things to say about it, I'm here for you, you know. So people may not know this, but I'm on Twitter, and I do have my DMs open. So, you know, I love hearing, and I've gotten some really, really amazing stories from, you know, because the game came out during the pandemic, and they said this got them through it, you know, or people gamers who have, you know, suffered personal loss, and the game touched them individually. That stuff is always amazing as a writer and a creator. So, you know, thanks for playing. Thanks for giving it the time, and for, you know, making Days Gone part of your life.
Yeah, and I'm sure, you know, we all want to say thank you to you for creating such an amazing game that, like you say, it's literally changed people's lives. It's touched people emotionally, and it's fucking fun to play. I'm on my 9th playthrough at the moment. I have over 800 hours in the game, and I can't stop playing it.
Well, you know, I didn't finish listening to your interview with Jeff, but just so people know, that's all Jeff, right? His core, you know, to his core, what he is a gamer. And man, I tell you, some of the early parts of that game were rough and were not fun to play. And you can thank Jeff and his team, you know, and the whole team as well. But literally the dude playing the game and making it fun. That's all Jeff.
Now, you two make a good team. You've worked together before in other games. Is there any chance you team up again for something in the future?
Yeah, we've actually talked about it. So, I don't want to go into a ton of details, but yeah, Jeff and I talked about doing a startup at one point, and we had an IP before I started working on Asphalt that I ended up stealing a bunch of ideas from. But anyway, it was yeah, definitely. I think we do work together well, because we have worked together since the first Siphon Filter game. So, we brought him in as a level designer way back then, and it didn't take him long to sort of move up the ranks, and then he kind of moved out on his own and was game directing at other places for a while. But I brought him back to work on Resistance Retribution, and then he worked on Uncharted Golden Abyss with me, and then obviously Days Gone. So the guy's really good at what he does, and I do think that you need a solid gameplay guy and a solid story guy in order to make an amazing experience, because it could be the best story in the world, but if the game's not fun to play, then you don't have a game.
Yes, that's true.
Yes.
All right, finally, a question I like to ask all my guests. If you found yourself in the world of Days Gone, how would you fare, and which camp would you join?
Well, given where I'm at now, 63 years old, well, 62, but I'm preparing myself for my birthday in a month.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, right. And so I don't know, this is something else that I don't see talked about a lot, that I was expecting to get more reaction to, is that there are a lot of old people in Days Gone. There's a lot of, there really are. There, like Iron Mike and Tucker and the Colonel, man. And, it's like, I just think that it's an underrepresented group, that old people, and by old people, I mean people my age, right? It's like, I think that there's a lot of stories to be told there, like, from their perspectives and their experience, and, and what they can bring to something. So, yeah, I would kind of picture myself being at Iron Mike's camp, and, being one of those dudes that you see, barking orders at people out on the farm, and, trying to help things run more smoothly. So that's where I would definitely want to be. And probably not the type that would have a gun and be out hunting on freakers, or, would not look forward to fighting in a Ripper War. That's kind of not me.
You'd be kind of more like team leader.
I would teach art classes.
That would be awesome.
I would be helping Iron Mike, carve his pinnacle board, or whatever it was.
Yes. All right, a couple things before we wrap up. You can support the Days Gone podcast via buymeacoffee.com/8bitterror. You can do a one-time contribution or become a member. There are various levels, each with their own perks and rewards, and membership starts for as little as $1 a month. You can check out all the details at buymeacoffee.com/8bitterror. And I want to give a big shout out to my members. They are Miranda Satin, Basics of Pain, Captain Caffeine, Jay Stabby, Obscured by Ink, Hani Okashay, Anton G, Tom Moose, James Guan, Borislav 24/7, Neanderthal Bard, WD Henderson, Dogbone, Passion Flower Percussion, Zylock DMB, Bex, Mike, Andy, Alexandru, Catherine the Great, Dandy Denny, Colourful Soldiers, CJ Voorhees, John Wagoner, Nomad 416, Marcus Horton, Hack Parachute, Roast Chestnut, Stickman, Daily Lad, Joey Image, Mr. Dutchy Dutch, Headhunter Telesto, Squirrel Jr., Kevin V, Sean Brooks, Joe Schmo, Andy Matthews, and Unleash the Goof. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can find the show. John, thank you so much for coming on the show. It has been a real pleasure talking with you.
Well, it's been fun. And if you get more questions and want to have me back on and just do a more sort of quick Q&A with things that fans might want to ask, I'm totally open to that, because my schedule's pretty open right now when I'm not writing.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Thanks a lot, Claire. Appreciate it.
You can email me your thoughts, comments, opinions, and counter-arguments at daysgonepod@gmail.com. You can also find me moderating the Days Gone subreddit. Thanks for listening. Weaver out.